KL Publications presents Life, Living Incarcerated for Eternity by Ryan C. Sanders. It was a humid September day in Missouri, the kind of day where the weight of the air felt almost as heavy as the world weighing on Marcellus Williams' shoulders. A world he hadn't chosen. For over 2 decades, he had lived incarcerated for eternity, a life sentence in all but name, a death sentence in all but finality. Williams sat in his small windowless cell staring at the center block walls. They told stories not of who he was, but of a system that had failed him. His mind wandered to the outside world, a place he hadn't seen in years. In a place not too far away, Jordan, a young public defender just starting out, was poring over the files of Marcellus's case. There was something about it that haunted him. The DNA evidence or lack thereof, the shaky testimonies of the incentivized witnesses, and the systematic racial biases that colored every corner of this case. This wasn't justice. This was something else, something much darker. He knew he needed to act, but he also knew that changing the fate of a man like Marcellus Williams would require much more than filing a few motions. This was a machine, a system entrenched in years of bias, indifference, and a culture of punishment over rehabilitation. It wasn't built to admit mistakes. The advocate's call to action. Across town, a seasoned advocate named Elena, who had fought against wrongful convictions for years, was on the phone with Jordan. Elena knew that change didn't come easy, especially in Missouri. It had taken years to even get Governor Eric Greitens to stay Marcellus's execution. And that board of inquiry, it had never even issued its report before the new governor, Mike Parson, dissolved it. But Elena had learned over time that change happens in moving parts. And sometimes it required multiple hands to turn the gears. "We can't wait on one system to fix itself," she said firmly into the phone. "We need the court of public opinion. We need pressure, and we need people to wake up to what is happening here. There are too many men like Marcellus sitting in the cells, and too many who have already been lost." Jordan knew she was right. It wasn't just about filing motions. It was about making people care. They would need journalists, activists, lawmakers, even those who had once sat on the other side of the fence. The prosecutors, the police chiefs, the judges who once played their parts in twisted ways. A broken system. It was lunchtime in the prison, but Marcellus wasn't hungry. He pushed a tray aside and pulled out a pen and a paper. Writing was one of the few ways he could still feel human. Over the years, he had written dozens of letters to his family, to the supporters, and to himself. The one he wrote now was addressed to no one in particular. Living incarcerated for eternity. That's what it felt like. A life where the days stretch endlessly into each other, where no time no longer moved forward, only in circles. He thought about all the other black men he had met inside the system, many who were caught up for lesser crimes, actually. Some who were just as innocent as he was. Men who have been buried alive by the system that could not admit it had been wronged. "I wonder if people out there know what it's like to be forgotten," he wrote. "I wonder if they care. Maybe they think if they forgot me, they can forget about what put me here too." But he knew there were people who cared, people like Jordan, like Elena, and that gave him some small silver sense of hope. Even if it was dim, it was there. A community rallies. Back in the city, a group of activists gathered in a local community center. The walls was adorned with posters reading "Justice for Marcellus" and "End the Death Penalty." There were young people, many who had seen the system up close through family members, and there were elders who had been part of the civil rights movement decades before. Together they strategized on how to make Marcellus' story known. "We need to do more than just protest," said Malik, a young organizer who had been involved in local movements for racial justice. "We need to take this fight to the Capitol." We need to speak to lawmakers. We need to get the media to cover this. We need to change the way people think about what justice looks like. Elena had seen how these grassroots efforts could work. Public pressure could move mountains. Let's organize a rally at the courthouse, she said. And let's make sure that every lawmaker in the state knows that people are watching. They need to understand that they'll be held accountable for Marcellus's life. The plan was set in motion. Flyers were printed, social media campaigns were launched, and phone calls were made to every newsroom in the state. This wasn't just about Marcellus anymore. This was about every man and woman wrongfully convicted, every person trapped in a system that valued punishment over humanity. A legal battlefield. Back at the courthouse, Jordan prepared for the upcoming hearing. This was a battlefield, one where the stakes were nothing less than life and death. He knew the cards were stacked against him. Missouri's attorneys general made it clear that he wasn't interested in reviewing the case again. And the state Supreme Court had already denied several appeals, but Jordan wasn't going to give up. We have new evidence, he reminded himself. We have DNA evidence that excludes Marcellus. We have witnesses who have recanted. We have a governor who dissolved a board that could have saved his life. But what Jordan knew, what every public defender knew, was the truth wasn't always enough. The system wasn't designed to reverse its decisions, especially when it came to capital punishment. To admit that it had been wrong, that it had come within hours of executing an innocent man, was a threat to its very foundation. The power of voices. Marcellus sat in his cell listening to the faint sound of voices outside. He didn't know what they were saying, but he knew they were there for him. He had heard from his lawyer about the rally, about the people gathering to demand his life to be spared. In a way, it was surreal. He had spent so many years feeling invisible, as though the world had forgotten him, and now these people, many of whom he had never met, were fighting for him, for his right to live. He wasn't sure if it would be enough, but for the first time in years, he felt seen. The fight continues. The rally outside the courthouse was growing larger. Signs were waved, chants echoed through the air, and speeches were made calling for justice, not just for Marcellus, but for every black man who had been wrongfully convicted, for every family that had been torn apart by the criminal justice system. Inside, Jordan was making his case. He pointed to the DNA evidence, to the racial bias in the jury selection, to the incentivized witness testimonies that had been the foundation of the prosecutor's case. He argued that Marcellus had been denied a fair trial, that his conviction had been built on lies. But whether or not the judge would listen remained to be seen. A system on trial. The case of Marcellus Williams was no longer just about one man. It was about a system that had failed over and over again to protect the most vulnerable. It was about a society that had allowed racial bias and corruption to seep into every corner of its institutions. It was about a nation that had forgotten what justice was supposed to mean. As the day wore on, Marcellus' fate remained uncertain. The rally outside continued, with more people joining every hour. But inside the courthouse, the wheels of justice moved slowly, grinding against the weight of decades of systematic failure. Jordan sat in the courtroom waiting for the judge's decision. He didn't know what the outcome would be, but he knew one thing: this fight wasn't over. Even if Marcellus's life was spared, even if they managed to stop his execution, there were still thousands of men and women like him, people living incarcerated for eternity, for crimes they hadn't committed, or for a sentence that was far outweighed for their offenses. A call to action. Marcellus Williams' story didn't have an ending, at least not yet. And maybe that was the point. The story wasn't about one man's life or death. It was about all of us. It was about the choices we make every day, the small decisions that either uphold the status quo or challenge it. It was about the responsibility we have to think better, to be better, to create a world where justice isn't just a word, but a reality. The fight for justice is never over, but as long as we continue to stand up, to speak out, and to demand better, there is hope. There is always hope. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe.